Let's welcome Dr. Carson one more time.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Okay. I am delighted to see so many people here. I went out and spoke to the big overflow crowd out there. There are a couple, like 3 seats up here if somebody wants to sit in them. Oh, wait a minute. There's one of them. And there's another one of them. All right. You know, interestingly enough, when we started this thing, my wife was not at all enthusiastic about it, and that's putting it mildly. But then we had 2 little granddaughters, and you know, she looked in their faces, and she said, "How can we not do this? Because they're not going to have a future at the rate that we were going." You know, we live in such an amazing nation. You know, you think about people who say that this is not an exceptional nation, they don't know what they're talking about. Think about this, 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, 5,000 years before America came on the scene, people did things exactly the same way. Chop down the corn or the wheat, bundle it up, put it on their wagon, hitch up the horses, go into town, sell it. Within 200 years of the advent of America, men were walking on the moon. It changed the fundamental trajectory of mankind. It is the most exceptional nation the world has ever known. Anybody who denies that is denying reality. But it means that we need to preserve that exceptionalism. We don't need to try to be like everybody else. You know, there is such a thing as the American way. There is such a thing as the American dream. Does anybody else have a dream? Nobody else has a dream. In other countries, they may have a nightmare, but nobody else has a dream, you know? And that's why we don't have to try to be like them. We need to be like us, you know? And for me, it was such an incredible land of dreams. I wanted to be a doctor. There was nothing else that really interested me, even as a very young person. Skip right over policemen and firemen. And, you know, I just wanted to be a doctor. I loved going to the doctor's office, which tells you I was a strange kid, you know? I mean, I would gladly sacrifice a shot just to smell the alcohol swabs, you know? And if I could put the stethoscope on, oh my goodness, and anybody who had a heart that wanted to be listened to, I was right there with it. I was ready to listen. But, you know, you probably wouldn't have thought that I was going to be a doctor if you had seen me, because I was a horrible student. You know, we lived in poverty, and, you know, my mother was very concerned about my academic performance or lack thereof, and my brother was also doing poorly, and she didn't know what to do. She only had a 3rd grade education herself, raised in our huge rural family, got married when she was 13, tried to escape that horrible environment. They moved to Detroit. She discovered some years later that my father was a bigamist, so she had to raise us by herself. And she would work, leave the house at 5 in the morning, get back at midnight, going from job to job to job, because she didn't want to be on welfare, and she didn't want to be a victim. And the interesting thing is she never felt sorry for herself, and that was a good thing. The problem is she never felt sorry for us either. So, you know, there was never any excuse that we could give that was satisfactory to her. But, you know, she was very alarmed about my lack of academic prowess. So she prayed, and she asked God to give her to wisdom to know what to do. And you know, that's the wonderful thing about God. You don't have to have a PhD to talk to him. You just have to have faith. That's all you need. And, you know, she had faith that he would give her the wisdom, and he did. Now, my brother and I didn't think it was that wise. I mean, turning off the TV, what kind of wisdom is that? Making us read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Library to submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read. But we didn't know that. And, people are always saying, why did you read the books? Your mother was always out working. She would have known if you hadn't read them, believe me. And back in those days, you had to do what your parents told you. There was no social psychologist saying, let the kid express themselves. So, you had to do. But, as I started reading those books, I started reading about people. I started reading about scientists, doctors, explorers, philosophers, all kinds of successful people. And I began to understand that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. And it's not the environment. And you don't have to be a victim unless you choose to be a victim. And I used to hate being poor. Poverty bothered me a lot until I started reading about these people. And then I realized that poverty was only temporary, that I could change that. And once I knew I could change it, it didn't bother me at all to be poor. And, it was an attitude change, and that is so vitally important because that's what America is about. It's about having the possibilities of doing things. Doesn't mean that anybody gives you anything except the opportunity to be able to climb the ladder. And this is interesting because a lot of people, particularly in the left wing, they say Carson is a hypocrite because he grew up poor and he must have had some government help. And now he wants to withdraw all the government aid programs, all the safety nets, which is a bunch of lies, of course. They love to tell lies because they're always trying to drive wedges between people. I thought it was very interesting this week when, I said that I don't think President Obama had the typical experience of an African American growing up. And, I said, they wanted to argue with me about that. I said, he grew up in Hawaii with his white grandparents who were very affluent, went to a private school, spent his formative years in Indonesia with his white mother. Show me an African American that has that experience, And then they want to say, well, but you're saying that being raised white is a horrible thing. I never said being raised white was a horrible thing. And you're saying that there's racism. I never said that there's racism every place. I simply said that the president's experience does not reflect the typical African American. That's all they do is sit there and try to pick at stuff and then try to drive wedges and to create their narrative. But I've been used to that, since the very beginning. They've tried to write my political obituary every week. They just, anything that comes up, they seize on it. Carson said this and Carson said that. Oh my goodness, it's kind of funny. I'm the first person in history to have 4 separate Saturday Night Live segments. And of course, as my political star began to rise, when I was writing at the top in the polls, and they looked at the thing that really worried them, they looked at my head-to-head against Hillary. And I mean, it wasn't even close, just blowing her out of the water. They said, we have got to get rid of this guy. So they couldn't find any scandals. So they said, well, let's make people question the veracity of his biography. He couldn't possibly have had a temper like that because he's such a nice guy now. So obviously that was all made up. So they go back and they interview people in my hometown who knew me after I got rid of the temper. And they said, see, they didn't know about it, so clearly he's not like that. And finally, an article showed up in Parade magazine from 1997 where they interviewed my mother, and she talked all about my temper. And they said, all right, well, we won't talk about that anymore. And then there was a West Point story, and they said, well, General Westmoreland wasn't in Detroit in May. Well, it turns out he was there in February for a Congressional Medal of Honor dinner, which I was invited to, went to, and had a chance to meet him. But once the actual data was discovered, and they knew that he, in fact, had been there at that time, well, we won't talk about that anymore. And then there was the Yale story about my honesty, and they said, we can't find any evidence of that. BuzzFeed, of all people, found the article that showed it, of all people. So virtually every lie that they tell has been obliterated. Do they ever come back and say that? No. They just try to destroy you. And then they say, well, he's got no foreign policy knowledge, no experience. Well, 2 weeks ago, I was at a foreign policy summit, prosperity, peace, and security in Gaffney, South Carolina. 1 full hour on the foreign relation challenges of America. And, there were much more media than there is back there now, wall to wall. There was only one article that I saw that came out of that, and it was saying they were flabbergasted with my depth of knowledge of foreign policy. The rest of them said nothing. Because the reason they were there was to try to catch a gaffe, to find something that they could criticize, and they couldn't find anything, so they just went away. But you know what? I don't worry about that stuff, because if God be for you, who can be against you? You don't have to worry about that. But it does mean we have to put our best foot forward, and we have to do our best and then let God do the rest. That's really the key. But back to what I was talking about. The left says Carson wants to obliterate all of these programs. It's just the opposite. What I want to do is create ladders of opportunity so people can climb out of a state of dependency and become part of the fabric and strength of America. That's what America is all about. And the very people who claim to be the compassionate ones are the ones who I believe have created the big problem. They pat people on the head, say, there, you poor little thing, I'm going to take care of all your needs. I'm going to give you food stamps and housing subsidies and free health care and everything. And those bad people over there, they don't want you to have that stuff. I'm the savior. Make sure you vote for me. That is just despicable, I believe, making people dependent generation after generation. Some of the welfare policies that break apart families rather than policies that bring families together. And that's the number one cause of poverty, is broken families. So, these are all things that I think we need to address as a nation, and we can address. Because what we have to understand is we only have 330 million people. China has 1.4 billion people. India has 1.1 billion people. And that means we have to develop all of our people if we're going to be able to be competitive into the future. And that's not going to happen unless we begin to change some of our policies. We need to have educational policies that really work. When you look at the people who apply to the military, 71% of people between ages of 17 and 24 are rejected. 71% for mental, physical, or educational reasons, the most prominent of those being educational reasons. So you see, this is a matter of national security that we're dealing with. And we have to have the right kind of education. We have to have school choice. And we don't need Common Core. Common Core out the door. We don't need that. In fact, the more we can get the government out of our lives, the better off we're going to be as a society. And I want to tick off some of the things that the government is doing to us right now. They are destroying the American dream. And I'll tell you one perfect example of that. Our federal debt $19 trillion. Now, we can say that number, but it's an absurd number. You can't really conceive of a number that big. But to put it in perspective, if you try to pay it off at $10 million a day, 365 days a year, it would take you more than 5,000 years. That is a real problem. We're putting that on the backs of our children. Thomas Jefferson said it's immoral to pass debt on to the next generation. I mean, if we could bring him back today and he could see what was going on, he would immediately stroke out and die. I mean, he just wouldn't even be able to conceive of what we're doing here. But you know what? That's the good news. That's the good news. Because the fiscal gap is even worse than that. How many people know what the fiscal gap is? I'm going to call on you, so make sure you know. All right, I'm just kidding. But most people really don't know about it. Washington politicians will not talk about the fiscal gap. You'll never hear them talk about it. But I'm not one of them, so I will talk about it. Okay? And what it is the unfunded liabilities that we owe as a nation: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, all the governmental programs, the federal agencies, sub-agencies, all that money that's owed, infinite horizon accounting, versus what we have coming back from tax revenues and other revenue sources, which should be multiple, because we own as a nation over $150 trillion in assets. You give a good company that knows how to manage assets $150 trillion, believe me, the spinoff of that would take care of our national debt. But to say that we run our government like a business would be a farce. I mean, our business would not last for a week if it was run like our government is. But at any rate, those two numbers should be almost equivalent: what we owe, what we have coming in, if we were fiscally responsible. If we're not, a gap forms. And you bring that forward to today's dollars, it's called the fiscal gap. It sits at over $200 trillion. It is mind-boggling to even think about. If somebody came along today and they said, "We got a gift for you, United States. Here is a check for $19 trillion to pay off your national debt." And some people would be dancing in the streets. We wouldn't even be close to being out of trouble. That's what people don't know. And that's why it is so important for us to disseminate the right kind of information so that we don't keep going down the same pathway, the exact same pathway that we've been going down. We paint it a little differently, call it something different, but it's all the same. It's the same stuff. We need a radical change, and that's why we need somebody who is a member of we the people and not they the politicians. Do that. Okay? And that's the reason. That's the reason that I absolutely refuse to accept money from special interest groups and billionaires who want to influence me. I will not do it. And believe me, we get calls from them all the time. I've got unanswered calls on my phone right now. "Oh, if you could just do this, and you do this, or if you drop out and support this guy, or if you do, and then we'll give you all this money, and we'll make sure that you become senator here." And what a bunch of crap. You know, this is, you know. I mean, this is about saving our nation. This is not about horse trading and making deals, and it's certainly not about a job. It is about a nation that I love because it's been so good to me. You know? And we have to make sure it's going to be good for our children, and it's not going to be if we keep this up. We have to be able to stop it. And the good thing is we can fix this. You know, I want you to think about this part of the American dream. Joe the Butcher, every Friday, used to go to the bank and he'd put 5 to 10% of his check in his savings account, and he would watch it grow over the next few decades, and he could retire with a nice nest egg with or without Social Security and live happily ever after. That's gone. Have you noticed that you don't get anything in your savings account anymore? The reason that there is no interest to speak of is because the national debt is so high. The Fed has to keep the interest rate suppressed, because even at near zero interest rates for the last decades, we still pay $250 billion in interest on that loan every single year. The debt service would be $1 trillion if we allowed interest rates to rise to a normal level. That's the problem. And, he can't make any money in the bond market for the same reason. The only place you can make any money is in the stock market. Well, who can put money in the stock market? Well-to-do people. So what happens? The income gap grows. Along comes Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton talking about the income gap and those evil rich people. And if we just take their money, everything will be okay. It is not the evil rich people. It is the evil government that is causing these problems for our people. And the government needs to be trimmed. It needs to be trimmed down significantly. There's 4.1 million federal employees. That's ridiculous. And, tens of thousands of them retire every year. They don't have to be replaced. In a Carson administration, they would not be replaced. And we would shift people around, to cover critical positions, but by attrition, we would take care of that problem very, very effectively. There's 645 federal agencies and sub-agencies, way, way too many. And I would bring in the director of each one, and I would say, trim your budget by 2 to 3%, or resign, whichever is easier for you. And then I would say, it has to be done in a way that the people won't even notice that it was done. Because you remember a few years ago, when they tried to trim budgets, they were told to trim them in a way that people would feel it the most, so that no one would be asking for that in the future. What a bunch of garbage. This is not effective governing. And this is what's been going on, and I'm sorry to say it's been going on with both Republicans and Democrats. These are issues that affect all of us. So obviously what we need to do is drive that debt back down. How do we drive that debt down? Well, we make the appropriate cuts in government, but also we have to get that economic engine roaring again. And all we have to do is unfetter it with all these ridiculous regulations. There's a gazillion regulations. Just to give you an example, the employer mandate. It used to be when you started a new business, you were so proud. You called your mom. Mom, I started a new business. I got 10 employees. The next year you had 20, then 30, then 40. Ooh, better stop. Don't want to hit 50 and have that kick in and take all your profits away. That is the very backbone of the economy, small business in America. And when we stifle it with our stupid regulations, of course we're going to have chronically depressed economy. That's infantile in terms of understanding, and yet our government doesn't seem to understand it. If they do understand it, then it must be that they want our economy to do poorly. I'm not sure which one of those two things is actually going on. But we also need to fix our tax code. We have the most ridiculous tax code that there is, And taxes were supposed to be to bring the money in so that we could run the government. And then somebody got the brilliant idea, we can use this tax code to control people's behavior. And then it just expanded and kept expanding, and now it's something that's ridiculous. That's why I proposed a flat tax, 14.9% across the board, starting at 150% poverty level. But even the people below that will still have to pay something, because everybody has to have skin in the game. And, and then there, no deductions, no loopholes, no shelters, no anything that people can, screw around with and somehow take advantage of. Everybody has to have the same situation. And No double taxation, no death tax, no capital gains tax. Nothing that you've been taxed on already gets taxed again. See, that's the reason that, Forbes has said this is the most pro-growth tax plan that's out there. That's why Cato has praised it, and Wall Street Journal and many others have praised it, because it makes sense. Now, do you ever hear the media talking about my tax plan? No. They only talk about anything negative that they can find. They don't want the people to know. You'll notice that, they try to blank me out. They try to act like I don't exist. But I do. And, if you want to find out, if you really want to read some good policy, go to bencarson.com, because it is all there. Now, some people say about the tax plan, that's no fair, because, the rich, they still have a lot of money left. I base it on the Bible, on tithing. The left likes to make fun of that. But I think the Bible's a pretty good book, and I think God's a pretty fair guy. So, and he said, I want to tithe. He didn't say if you have a bumper crop, give me triple tithe. He didn't say if your crops fail, you don't owe me anything. So there must be something inherently fair about proportionality. You make $10 billion, you pay $1 billion. You make $10, you pay $1, you get the same rights and privileges. How could anything be more fair than that? But some people say, no, they say it's not fair because the guy who put in $1 billion still has $9 billion left. We need to take more of his money. Well, that's called socialism, and it doesn't work in this country. We should reject it. And I think Margaret Thatcher had the best description of socialism. She said, it's a great system until you run out of other people's money. And that's exactly what's going to happen. But, if we fix our tax code and we get rid of the unnecessary regulations, the economy will explode. There will be all that trillions of dollars sitting on the sideline will come back in. There'll be plenty of jobs. You look at manufacturing, small manufacturers. The average cost per employee in regulatory costs is $34,000 a year. How are they supposed to compete with other nations? This is the stuff that we have to deal with. We can deal with this stuff very quickly and get things moving. And in the Carson administration, one of the first things I would do is tell Congress, I'm not signing anything that borrows from the next generation. It's just not happening. And we will balance the budget quickly. Now, the other thing I want to touch on briefly, and then we'll take a few questions, is our national security. People are frightened in this country. And that is the reason that they're willing to overlook a lot of stuff in certain candidates. I won't mention any names. And because when somebody says, I'm going to protect you, and I'm going to make everything wonderful, and you're frightened, that sounds pretty good. But people have a tendency not to make the best decisions when they're angry or when they're frightened. What we need to do is we need to think logically. We need to think logically about this. Radical Islamic jihadists, they want to destroy us. They have made that very clear that they want to destroy us. We must destroy them first, and the sooner we do that, the better off we're going to be, because they continue to grow. Now, the question is, how do we destroy them? I think it's very good to understand who they are. And please, this weekend, when you have a little free time, won't take you that long, read up on the history of Islam. Read about jihadism and where it came from, and the legitimacy that they have to have by having territory. So the first thing you do is you have to take their territory away from them. Now, you might have noticed one of the things I've been talking about for several months is Libya, because that will really expand their caliphate and give them an enormous amount of power. You have to anticipate these things. Finally, the administration and the other candidates are starting to talk about it. But, this is a big deal because it's strategically located and there's a lot of oil there. But at any rate, you have to take their caliphate. And how do you do that? Well, I've heard some candidates saying 10,000 boots on the ground, 20,000 boots on the ground, 100,000 boots on the ground. That's not how you take it. You talk to your joint chiefs and your military experts, and you say, here is the goal. Now, what do you need to accomplish it? And that's what you give them, and you don't tie their hands behind their back. That's how you do it. You know, as this gentleman can tell you right here, who fought in World War II under General Patton, we have very good military people. We do. We have extremely good military people now. A lot of them have retired early because they don't want to be micromanaged by this administration. I've talked to some of those people. They would be willing to come back. But we use our military the right way. We cut off their funding. There's no way they get any oil, and I've been saying that for a long time. For years I've been talking about that. You cut off all their channels for dissemination of money because they go after the disaffected people and they pay them. If they can't pay them, they can't get them. We go after their command and control centers. They should be always on the run. They should never be able to stop and settle. And then in this country, we have to keep them from coming in here by securing our borders. We have the ability to secure the border, believe me. Yuma County, Arizona, they put in a layered fence with an asphalt road for quick access. They put border guards on the border. Now, there's a novel idea. And then they actually prosecuted first-time offenders. No catch and release like we have now. And they stopped the illegal traffic by 97%. 97%, okay? That was before the current Justice Department decided that that was too effective and they went in and dismantled the program. But you do that same thing across all 9 sectors, and it wouldn't take that long to do. It wouldn't be that expensive. And you stop that, you add in motion detectors and drones for early detection. Some people say they'll just dig a tunnel underneath. No, they won't, because we have radar equipment that will show whether that's happening. So we can stop it. And then you also, you have to look at their internet trafficking here, the terrorists. You have to follow it wherever it goes, and you have to be willing to execute what needs to be done. We can't be worried about political correctness and somebody calling us Islamophobic, you know, and then, you know, destroy their servers if necessary. Cyber attack, do whatever you need. Some people say that's dirty, but they're dirty people, so we can use dirty tactics. That's not a problem. And then, you know, the president's solution is we take the guns away from our people. After San Bernardino and the Paris attack, we limit the guns for our people. That solves the problem. Are you kidding me? What the government should be doing is offering free gun safety classes to all Americans so we can take care of ourselves. But, you know, I find it fascinating because some people, they say, well, Carson, he's too nice. You know, he can't possibly take care of these issues with terrorists and stuff like that. And he's weak because he never yells and shouts. Let me tell you a secret. I used to yell and shout. I used to get in a lot of trouble. But it was God who cured me of that. And I got to tell you something. When people cannot make you angry, that is a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. Okay? Okay. And speaking of God, you know, we have to get over this phobia that has been incited by the secular progressives about God. And they want you to think that, you know, you're not supposed to talk about God in public. That somehow that offends them. And they're offended if they see a cross. And they're offended if they see a crash scene. Well, you know what? Just let them be offended. I don't have a problem with them being offended. But they don't get to impinge upon our rights of freedom of expression. And you know, those freedoms were hard fought. And a lot of our ancestors gave up their lives so that we could have those freedoms, and we cannot allow them to be usurped. And it means that we have to be willing to stand up. But here's what I want you to remember going away. Thomas Jefferson said it, that we would get into this position because we would not be vigilant. We would not be paying attention, and as a result, the government would do what all governments naturally do. They grow, they metastasize, they infiltrate, and they dominate. But he said that just before we turned into another form of government, the people of America would recognize that they were being manipulated. They would wake up, they would rise up, and they would regain control of America. I say now is the time that we take it back.
I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Candy Carson, and I approve this message. But I've got a couple other things to say. You heard him talk about the American dream and keeping it alive, and this is something that was provided for us by God. Let us all take a pledge to not only take a stand and make a stand for the man who has the best plan. Okay? Think about it, taking a stand. What does that mean? You got to get out there and vote. 93 million registered voters didn't vote last time. That would have made a big difference. 25 to 30 million of those were evangelicals. We've got to take that stand. But we also got to make a stand. We've got to share this with others, help them understand that we need our country back for the next generations. After we make a stand, we're doing this for the man who has the best plan, not just any plan, and he doesn't have any political ties. So can you say it with me? Let's take and make a stand for the man with the best plan. Can you do that again? Let us take and make a stand for the man with the best plan. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you guys for coming out. I want to thank Julie McCarthy and the Tennant County Tea Party for putting this together, for getting the word out. And basically,